This is the story of Larry, the Maryland Blue Crab, Part 3. The next morning, Bradley, Vaughn, Sam, and myself arrived at the railroad around 10:30 or so. The two Jakes made a run to Abel's house to take care of something, and they arrived about an hour later. While we were waiting for them to arrive, we pulled the crab out of the car barn and did an oil round. While we were doing this, we realized that we had accidentally made a big scorch mark on Jake Abel's flat car seat. The seat had been rubbing up against an air line on the compressor. Once the two Jakes arrived, we moved the crab to the steaming bay yard. Jake Abel didn't seem to mind too much about his seat. "It's a story to tell," he told us. I looked everything over and found the locomotive to be fit for duty, as much as it could be. Sam wanted to get the crab out on the road as a scheduled passenger train that day, so I worked in the Hidden Valley yard. For those who don't know, when the White Creek Railroad is having an operations meet, there are two kinds of trains allowed out on the road. The first is a freight train. This is a minimum of a locomotive and two riding cars, one for the engineer and another to serve as a caboose. These trains take cuts of 5 cars from Hidden Valley and deliver them to various industries along the White Creek line, setting off one car and picking up another in each town. The freight train then returns to Hidden Valley for 5 more cars, and the process starts over. The other kind of train is a passenger train. These trains follow a set schedule and can be anything equipment-wise. The passenger trains are a good way for an engineer to get to know the railroad, but they are mostly there to mess with the freight trains. Because the crab was not able to move more than itself, Sam chose to try to run it as a passenger train. Sam marked up for passenger train number 103. The run would take him from Hidden Valley Yard down to 3 Mile Island and Cornertown before passing back through Hidden Valley and around the Reed Lake Loop. He was scheduled to depart about 10 minutes after the hour. About 15 minutes before departure time, Sam backed the crab down to the passenger track. Once there, he discovered that someone else had been assigned his train number, so after some confusion, Sam took a later departure. Sam parked next to the other train and shut the compressor off so as to not be a disturbance to the other engineer. When departure time came, the other train attempted to pull out, but derailed due to a mechanical problem. The engineer gave Sam the train number, and Sam got ready to depart. He pulled the cord to start the compressor, and it didn't fire. He tried several more times with different throttle and choke positions, but the compressor just would not start. I then came over and tried to get it started. We tried everything we could think of. Full throttle, no throttle, full choke, no choke, any combination of them. After a while, I checked the pressure gauges and found the crab still had about 90 pounds of air on the dial. I closed the crab's tank valve and drained the air out of the compressor's tank. I then recoupled the air lines and pulled the start cord again. The compressor fired right up. It took a minute for the compressor to rebuild its air, and Sam was finally ready to go. Sam departed Hidden Valley Yard about 15 minutes behind schedule on a 40-minute run. Following his schedule, he made his way through Skyview, Greenville, Appletree, Sheridan, Landfill, and Timothy before he crossed the trestle onto 3 Mile Island. He rounded the loop on the island and crossed back over the trestle. Up until then, the compressor had been regularly cycling between building air and idling, as air usage had been minimal. Once Sam reached the end of the trestle heading for Cornertown, the compressor kicked into gear and stayed that way for the rest of the run to Hidden Valley. After passing through Cornertown, Sam faced a long uphill climb to Glenwood. The crab was just not up to the task. Sam had the throttle wide open, and the crab still needed him to do some duck walking from his seat to keep moving. Progress was slow, and he created a 4-train backup while he made his way up the grade. Sam crested the grade and continued on, but he still had a bit of a climb and a locomotive struggling to keep up. Eventually, with a great deal of duck walking, he arrived back in Hidden Valley. Once he was back in the yard, the rest of the run was canceled. Sam had a brief talk with the yardmaster before backing the crab into the steam bay and shutting it down. He had arrived back in Hidden Valley Yard approximately a half-hour late. Some of the next hourly passenger trains had already left by the time he had returned. The crab remained in the steam bay yard until that evening, when most of the operations had wound down for the day. I had wanted to take the crab out for a run, and I figured now would be a good time. Jake Abel and the rest of the group was getting ready to do another freight run and invited me along, but again I declined. They took off to switch a few cars at Reed Lake. I went over to the steam bay, oiled up the crab, fired up the compressor, and started out towards Reed Lake myself. I figured since the crab had done this run so easily last night, I shouldn't have too much trouble. I reached Hillside and encountered a red signal. I waited for 2 trains, the first being the rest of my group on a Grand Trunk GP9, the other being one of the White Creek regulars. When the second train had cleared, I claimed the block and proceeded down the hill. I got about halfway to Oak Lee when the compressor shut down. No warning, it just shut down. I still had enough air to power the crab, so I coasted into town and made sure I got into the siding before stopping and releasing the block behind me. I got off the crab and walked back to the compressor. I gave the start cord several good pulls. The compressor didn't start. After a couple minutes, I got a hunch, and a quick look in the gas tank confirmed it. We had run the compressor dry. I made a rather embarrassed phone call to the rest of the group, and they came back down the Reed Lake line. They passed right through Oakley in order to turn at Reed Lake. This was to allow the crab to be tacked onto the rear of their train. When they came back, we looked at the crab's riding flat car and noticed that the back of the compressor was hanging off the end of the car. It was sticking out just enough that if we coupled the crab straight to the caboose, we may have bashed in its rear railings. After a few minutes of switching, a flat car from the Jeep's train was placed behind the caboose. We coupled that to the crab, and moments later it was riding back up the hill to Hidden Valley. Once the crab was parked back in the steam bay yard, Sam got on Jake's freight train and I borrowed his truck to go buy some gas. One gas can from the local tractor supply and one stop at the local gas station later, the compressor was back up and running. The next trip down to Reed Lake was uneventful. In fact, it was very relaxing. For a few moments, rolling downhill, looking over top the little locomotive, I got a sense for what live steam railroading is, and I liked it. The crab rolled into a slight uphill grade on the Reed Lake loop and just about ground to a halt. I opened the throttle wide and gave a Flintstones-style assist. I stopped before re-entering the main line to let the air compressor catch up. Once the air was up to full pressure, I opened the throttle and started up the hill. The locomotive seemed to be using a great deal more air than it had when Sam had run it the night before. I made it partway up the hill before the air pressure had gotten so low that I had to start duck walking to keep moving. As I entered the siding at Oakley, I looked back and realized I'd forgotten to claim the signal block. Whoops. I stopped in the siding again to let the air compressor catch up. Once I had the air back, I made sure to claim the block and continued up the hill. The rest of the run back to Hidden Valley went the same way. The locomotive wasn't acting right. I thought I heard air leaking from the cylinders somewhere. Once I finished walking the locomotive into Hidden Valley, I parked it in the steam bay yard and I tightened every screw I could. I figured that would stop the leaking. I took the crab back out to Reed Lake and tried the hill again. If anything, the crab was running even worse. I found myself doing most of the work going up the hill. I again put the locomotive in the steam bay yard and looked it over, trying to figure out what was wrong. I informed the rest of the crew about the issues and that I'd work on it the next day. At this point, Dennis gathered us together under some of the trees at Hidden Valley Yard and conducted an interview for the article. When we finished, we began to shut things down for the day. Since Vaughn was leaving the next morning, we had him run the crab back to the car barn. He did notice that the locomotive was acting a lot more sluggish than it did when he had run it the day before. Jake Abel returned the borrowed GP9 to the White Creek shop building, and we headed home for the night. The next morning, Vaughn headed home from the cabin, and we made our way back to White Creek. When we arrived at Hidden Valley, I pulled the crab out of the car barn and walked it up to the steaming bay. Jake borrowed the Grand Trunk GP9 again, and the rest of the group took off with a freight run. Once they left, I turned my attention to the crab. I began tinkering and adjusting things, firing up the compressor, testing the engine, noting how that didn't fix it, and tinkering some more. I did get the audible hiss toned down just a bit, but I failed to restore pulling power to the locomotive. Every time I thought I had it whipped, I took the crab off the bay and ran it back and forth on the steam bay leads. The track tests did little more than make it harder for those hanging around the RVs to hear each other. All this went on for a couple of hours before I decided the crab needed repairs that were beyond my capability to perform. The rest of the group pulled back into Hidden Valley Yard with their train, and a couple of them came over to see what I was doing. I told them I was in over my head. Jake Abel parked the GP9 in the steam bay yard. He and the rest of the group came over, and I explained what was going on. Dennis came by to see what we were up to. He began offering his input and experience on what was going wrong. We figured that one of the leaks was coming from the steam chests and began to disassemble the locomotive. Before long, we had the air tank and other air components torn down off the engine. We disassembled the steam chests and used a cement to reseal them. We then used the GP9 to drag the crab dead in tow back to the car barn for the cement to set. We set it in there, and then our focus turned back to operations. I hadn't been out on the White Creek main line except for the initial Grand Tour ride. Jake Abel put me on the crew of the Grand Trunk Jeep along with Jacob Pekowski. Bradley Duncan wanted to ride along as well, although after a minor argument between him and I, he elected to stay at Hidden Valley. We started the run as a regular freight train. We made 2 pickups and setouts, and then we got a radio call. Bad weather was on the way, and word had come down that all cars with wood decks, sides, or wood construction in general were to be pulled out of the sidings and off the railroad so they wouldn't be rained on. Our run went from a sedate freight run to a mad grab of wood and wood-decked cars. We scoured the entire southern half of the railroad looking for any and all cars that matched this description. A regular White Creek freight train pushes 9 cars at a stretch. By the time we had finished looking around and rolled into Hidden Valley, we had 9 wooden cars on top of 3 way freight cars and our own riding cars. We collected all the other wooden cars the other crews had retrieved, and we backed them down to the car barn. Once we got there, however, we found that all the car barn tracks were occupied by visiting equipment. We decided to push the crab further back in the barn and parked the wooden cars in front of it. The rain that was called for that evening didn't really come, by the way. I found out later that this sort of mad grab of freight cars is not normal, but for whatever reason, someone gave the order. We remained around the railroad, riding and talking trains for another couple hours before heading back for the cabin. The next day would be our last at White Creek. For this trip, anyways. Coming up next, our last day at White Creek, and what has happened since. Stay tuned, railfans.